people made fun of his steel cabin long before the first snow fell. They laughed when they passed by on the dirt road and saw the curved metal arch rising out of the clearing. Some slowed their trucks just to stare. Others shook their heads and kept going, already convinced they knew how the story would end. In a valley where log cabins meant strength and tradition, a steel shell looked like a mistake waiting to happen. Robert Hendricks, whom everyone called Dutch, noticed the looks but never reacted. He had returned from the war earlier that year with little more than a toolbox, a small loan, and a clear memory of cold winters that never forgave weak buildings. He had grown up watching his grandfather fight the Montana cold every year, feeding a stove that never seemed satisfied. He had seen strong men wake up exhausted before dawn just to split wood, knowing they would do the same thing again before nightfall. To Dutch, cold was not romantic. It was a problem that demanded a solution. The people around him believed winter was something you endured, not something you outsmarted. Cabins were built the way they had always been built. Thick logs. Stone foundations. A stove in the middle. If it was cold, you burned more wood. If you ran out of wood, you suffered. That was life. Anything else felt like cheating. So when Dutch bought a surplus steel hut and began setting it up on his land, the jokes came easily. Men at the lumberyard called it a shed. Someone said it looked like an army warehouse that got lost. Others warned him metal would freeze him solid. Steel, they said, sucked the warmth right out of the air. A metal home was no home at all. Dutch listened, nodded, and kept working. He didn't argue because he didn't need to. He had already seen what wind could do to a wooden cabin. He knew that cold air didn't just come from low temperatures. It came from movement. From gaps. From pressure. From wind pushing itself through every crack it could find. And he knew that stopping the wind mattered more than thick walls alone. Inside the steel arch, he began building a small wooden cabin. It was nothing fancy. Straight walls. A simple roof. Good joints. Tight seams. He left space between the steel and the wood, filling it with dry materials that trapped air without holding moisture. He added vents so air could move slowly instead of violently. He built a floor that didn't touch the frozen ground directly. Everything he did had a reason, even if he didn't use fancy words for it. People noticed that he didn't rush. He worked quietly, steadily, as if time itself was part of the plan. While others cut logs and stacked them for winter, Dutch focused on sealing, fitting, and adjusting. He tested doors. He checked drafts. He stood still inside his cabin and waited to feel cold spots. When he found one, he fixed it. The laughter grew louder as fall turned to winter. One builder said Dutch was hiding from nature. Another said he would learn his lesson the hard way. A few worried out loud that he was putting his family in danger. Fires, they said, behave badly in closed spaces. Metal sweats. Wood rots. Nothing about it made sense to them. Dutch heard all of it, but winter was coming, and winter would answer every question. The cold arrived just before Christmas, sharp and sudden. It did not drift in gently. It slammed down like a door being shut. Temperatures fell below zero and stayed there. Wind howled through the valley, bending trees and forcing itself into homes that had looked solid only weeks earlier. Stoves burned day and night. Woodpiles shrank fast. Inside traditional cabins, the same old problems returned. Cold floors. Drafts near doors. Frost creeping along window edges. Heat rose and vanished while cold pooled at ankle level. Families layered clothes indoors and still felt chilled. Sleep came in short stretches between stove feedings. The cold deepened after Christmas. By New Year's, it became dangerous. People stopped talking about comfort and started talking about survival. Some ran out of dry wood. Others burned whatever they could find. Furniture, crates, broken tools. Anything that would burn, and through it all, smoke rose quietly from Dutch's chimney. At first, no one noticed how thin it was. Smoke was smoke, and everyone was burning hard. But as days passed, people began to realize something strange. Dutch was not hauling wood every morning. He was not cutting late into the evening. He was not walking stiffly with cold the way everyone else was. Someone said they saw him outside splitting wood without gloves. Another claimed he was working in just a light jacket. Rumors spread slowly at first, then faster as desperation grew. Finally, one of the men who had laughed the loudest decided to see for himself. When he stepped inside the steel arch and opened the inner door, the warmth stopped him cold. It was steady, even, and calm. Not the sharp blast of overheated air near a roaring stove, but the kind of warmth that filled a room without noise. The fire was low. The walls were dry. The floor was warm. He did not say much when he left. He didn't need to. Word spread. People began stopping by under different excuses. Checking on him. Borrowing tools. Dropping off food. But they all wanted the same thing. To feel that warmth. To understand it. To see if it was real. Every visitor noticed the same things. No drafts. No frozen windows. No condensation dripping from metal. The steel shell outside was cold, but it did not matter. It took the wind. It absorbed the punishment. Inside, life continued as if winter had lost interest. By mid-January, some families could no longer stay in their cabins. They moved in with relatives. A few slept in barns with animals for shared warmth. The cold had humbled everyone. That was when the laughter stopped completely. No one mocked the steel cabin anymore. They didn't call it ugly. They didn't call it foolish. They asked questions instead. How thick was the insulation? How big was the air space? How much wood did he burn? The answers shocked them. Dutch was using a fraction of what they were using. And he was warmer. The realization was uncomfortable. It meant something deeper than one man building a clever cabin. It meant that the old way, the respected way, might not be the best way. And that was hard to accept. One by one, people admitted it quietly. Then more openly. Finally, even those who had criticized him publicly acknowledged the truth. Not with excuses. Just honesty. They didn't come begging loudly. They came humbly. They asked how to do it. Dutch did not refuse anyone. He did not brag. He did not say, "I told you so." He walked them through the space, explained what mattered and what didn't. He warned them about moisture. About airflow. About safety. He reminded them that copying without understanding could be dangerous. Some built their own versions the next year. Others adapted parts of the idea to their existing homes. Windbreaks. Airlocks. Better ceiling. Double walls. The valley changed slowly, but it changed. Years later, people would still talk about that winter. About how cold it was. About how close things came to breaking. And about the strange steel cabin that taught them something they hadn't wanted to learn, that survival doesn't care about tradition, that warmth doesn't come from pride, and that sometimes, the idea that looks wrong is the one that keeps you alive. After that winter, nothing in the valley felt the same. even when the snow melted and the rivers broke free from ice. People remembered how close they had come to losing more than comfort. They remembered the fear that settled in at night when the stove burned low and the wind pressed harder against the walls. And they remembered that one strange cabin that never seemed to struggle. Spring came late that year. When it finally arrived, it revealed damage everywhere. Cabins leaned slightly where frost had shifted their foundations. Chinking had fallen out of log walls. Chimneys cracked. Doors no longer fit their frames. Families spent weeks repairing what winter had taken from them. It was accepted as normal, the price of living in the mountains. Dutch's place needed almost no repairs. The steel arch had shed snow without complaint. The inner cabin was dry. The insulation was intact. The floor had never frozen. When people noticed that, they stopped pretending his success had been luck. They started asking harder questions. At first, the questions were cautious. What if the steel rusted? What about long-term moisture? What if the insulation settled? Dutch answered carefully. He didn't promise perfection. He explained trade-offs. He admitted what he was still watching closely. That honesty mattered more than confidence. By early summer, two men bought surplus steel arches of their own. They didn't announce it. They didn't brag. They just did it quietly, the same way Dutch had. One of them buried part of his structure into a hillside for extra protection from wind. The other built a thicker inner wall and added stone around his stove. Both came to Dutch more than once, asking questions, listening closely. The valley watched, not with mockery this time, but with curiosity. By the next winter, those two new steel-covered cabins stood ready. The cold returned, though not as brutally as before. Still, it was enough. Enough to test ideas. Enough to expose weaknesses. Both cabins performed well. Not perfectly, but far better than traditional homes nearby. Wood use dropped. Indoor temperatures stayed steady. People noticed again. By then, Dutch's cabin was no longer called strange. It was called practical. The conversations changed tone. Men talked about wind instead of just insulation. About sealing instead of thickness. About controlling air rather than fighting temperature. These were not new ideas to the world, but they were new to the valley. Dutch never stood at the center of those conversations. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was always grounded in experience. Cold moves, he would say. If you let it move, it'll find you. Some builders resisted longer than others. They had reputations. Pride. A way of doing things that had fed their families for decades. Admitting change felt like admitting failure. But winter didn't care about reputation. Slowly, even the most stubborn among them began adding small changes to their builds. Wind barriers. Entry vestibules. Better ceiling. Some didn't mention Dutch by name, but the influence was there. A few years passed, the steel cabin became part of local memory. New families moving into the valley heard about it almost immediately. Someone would point toward the land and say, "That's the place where the steel cabin stood." They laughed at him. Then they copied him. Dutch grew older. His children grew. They remembered winters that felt calm inside their home, even when storms howled outside. They didn't grow up fearing winter the way their neighbors had. To them, warmth was normal. When asked about the attention his cabin had brought, Dutch always deflected. He said he just built what made sense to him. He said the mountains taught him more than books ever could. He said cold teaches quickly, If you listen, what people eventually understood was that Dutch hadn't been trying to prove anyone wrong. He had been trying to solve a problem everyone else had accepted as unavoidable. The steel cabin didn't just change how people built homes. It changed how they thought about survival. It taught them that tradition was a starting point, not a rule book. That respecting the past didn't mean refusing the future. Years later, during another hard winter, a family new to the valley ran into trouble. Their woodpile ran low, and the temperature dropped faster than expected. Neighbors stepped in, as they always did. Someone suggested the old steel cabin. They stayed there for 3 nights. When they returned to their own place, they didn't laugh at the curved metal walls. They didn't care how it looked. They cared how it felt. And how safe it had been. That was the real legacy of the cabin, not the steel, not the insulation, not even the design. It was the lesson that survival belongs to those willing to question what everyone else accepts, and that sometimes, the shelter people laugh at today becomes the shelter they depend on tomorrow. As the years passed, the steel cabin stopped being talked about as a strange idea and started being talked about as a reference point. When someone complained about cold floors or endless firewood cutting, someone else would quietly say, "You know, Dutch never had that problem." It wasn't said loudly. It didn't need to be. Everyone knew what it meant. Builders began to notice something else as well. The cabins modeled after Dutch's idea didn't just stay warmer. They aged better. Walls stayed dry. Floors didn't warp. Mold was rare. Repairs were fewer. Winters still came, but they didn't leave the same scars behind. Slowly, winter stopped feeling like an enemy that had to be fought and started feeling like something that could be managed. Dutch himself never expanded his place. He didn't add rooms or change the design much. He believed that once something worked, you didn't need to keep proving it. His focus shifted to helping others understand the thinking behind it rather than copying it exactly. He warned people that steel alone was not magic. Without airflow, moisture control, and careful spacing, it could fail just like anything else. Some listened. A few didn't. Those who didn't usually learn the hard way. A poorly vented structure trapped moisture and rotted from the inside. Another lacked proper stove clearance and had to be rebuilt after a fire scare. These failures didn't disprove the idea. They reinforced the lesson Dutch had always tried to teach. Understanding mattered more than imitation. Younger builders paid closer attention. They were less tied to tradition and more open to learning. They asked why things worked instead of just how they had always been done. Some traveled to see other cold region homes. Earth-sheltered houses. Double-wall designs. Thick insulation paired with careful ventilation. They came back with ideas that blended old knowledge with new thinking. Dutch listened to them, too. He never acted like he had all the answers. When someone suggested an improvement, he considered it seriously. Sometimes he agreed. Sometimes he pointed out risks they hadn't considered. The conversations were quiet and respectful. They didn't feel like debates. They felt like problem solving. By the early 1960s, steel-covered structures were no longer rare in the region. They weren't everywhere, but they weren't shocking either. Some were painted to blend into the land. Others were partially buried. A few were hidden behind wooden facades to satisfy tradition while keeping the performance benefits. People learned how to balance appearance with function. The valley changed, but not all at once. There were still those who believed a real home had to look a certain way. They believed hardship built character. That suffering through winter was part of earning your place in the mountains. Dutch never argued with them. He simply lived differently. As he aged, he spent more time sitting quietly near the stove, listening to the wind hit the steel shell outside. He liked that sound. It reminded him that the storm was working hard and failing. That knowledge brought comfort. Visitors still came occasionally. Some just wanted to see the cabin they had heard about as children. Others came because they were building something of their own and wanted to avoid mistakes. Dutch welcomed them all. One winter, a particularly young couple arrived with a newborn child. They were scared. Not dramatic, just honest. They were new to the area and underestimated the cold. Dutch listened, nodded, and told them to stay the night. He gave them the warmest corner and made sure the fire was steady. The baby slept peacefully. The parents relaxed for the first time in weeks. In the morning, the men asked Dutch what made the biggest difference. Steel. Insulation. Design. Dutch thought for a long moment, then he said it was respect. Respect for the cold. Respect for how heat moves. Respect for the fact that nature doesn't care about pride. That answer stayed with the men for years. When Dutch passed away quietly in his sleep many years later, the valley remembered him not as a man who challenged tradition, but as a man who paid attention. Someone who observed, adjusted, and acted without noise. His cabin remained standing, still solid, still warm. People didn't turn it into a monument. They didn't need to. Its influence was already everywhere. In warmer homes. In smarter designs. In fewer frozen nights, and sometimes, when winter winds howled especially hard, someone would glance toward that old steel arch and remember a simple truth the valley had learned the hard way. People had laughed at his cabin, then they needed it to stay warm, and once you learn that lesson, you never forget it. After Dutch was gone, the cabin remained. It stood quietly, doing what it had always done, blocking wind and holding warmth without asking for attention. The land around it changed slowly. Trees grew taller. Paths shifted. New families arrived who had never met Dutch but had heard his name spoken with a kind of quiet respect. Some winters were mild. Others were cruel. Every time the cold grew serious again, the story resurfaced. Older men told it to younger ones while stacking wood or repairing fences. They spoke about the year the wind never seemed to stop. About the frost inside cabins. About the steel arch everyone laughed at until they stepped inside it. What made the story last was not just that the cabin worked. It was that it challenged something deeply rooted. For generations, people had believed that suffering through winter was proof of strength. That a home was supposed to leak heat. That cold floors and sleepless nights were part of earning your place in the mountains. Dutch's cabin quietly suggested something else. That strength could also mean preparation. That intelligence could replace exhaustion. That there was no honor in freezing when you didn't have to. That idea took time to settle. By the 1970s, building materials changed. Insulation improved. New techniques arrived from outside the valley. People started talking about efficiency, though they didn't always call it that. They talked about saving wood. About keeping heat where it belonged. About making homes that worked with the environment instead of against it. Many of those ideas felt new, but to those who remembered Dutch, they sounded familiar. Builders who had once mocked the steel cabin now taught younger apprentices about wind exposure and air sealing. They didn't always mention where they learned it, but the lesson was there. Stop the wind. Control the air. Let insulation do its job. Don't fight the cold directly. Outsmarted, the cabin itself was eventually sold. The new owners considered tearing it down. It didn't look like much to them. The steel was dull. The shape was strange. But an older neighbor stopped them. He told them to live in it for one winter before deciding. They did. They never tore it down. Instead, they repaired it carefully. They replaced insulation where needed. They respected the original design while making small updates for safety. They learned quickly what Dutch had known decades earlier. That comfort was not accidental. It was built. The cabin became a quiet teacher again. People came not just from the valley, but from farther away. Hunters. Builders. Folks curious about cold weather living. They didn't come for nostalgia. They came because winter was still real, still dangerous, still unforgiving if ignored. Some asked why more people hadn't adopted the idea sooner. The answer was always the same. People change slowly. Especially when pride is involved. The laughter that once followed the steel cabin wasn't cruelty. It was fear disguised as humor. Fear of being wrong. Fear of admitting that the old way might not be the best way. Dutch had faced that fear alone at first. He paid the price socially. He endured the looks, the comments, the quiet judgments. But he never stopped building, and he never stopped believing winter would tell the truth, and it did. The lesson carried forward into other areas of life as well. Farmers changed how they protected livestock. Workshops were built differently. Storage sheds were redesigned to stop wind instead of just blocking snow. The idea spread quietly, without credit, without argument. That was fitting. Dutch never wanted recognition. He wanted warmth. He wanted rest. He wanted to wake up in winter without dread. Years later, during another especially hard winter, the power went out across much of the region. Modern homes struggled. Electric heaters failed. Fuel deliveries were delayed. People once again depended on wood and good design. The old steel cabin stayed warm. People noticed again. They always did. Someone joked that the cabin had outlived every argument against it. Someone else said it had survived longer than many of the people who laughed at it. There was no bitterness in those comments. Just acknowledgement. The cabin wasn't perfect. No home ever is. But it was honest. It did exactly what it was built to do. Nothing more. Nothing less. In quiet moments, when the wind pressed hard against the valley and snow covered everything familiar, the cabin reminded people of something important. That survival is not about toughness alone. It's about paying attention. About respecting reality. About being willing to look foolish for a while if it means staying alive later. The steel arch still caught the wind first. It still took the punishment. Inside, life stayed calm, and somewhere in that calm was the echo of a man who had simply refused to accept that freezing was normal. People had laughed at his cabin, then they needed it to stay warm, and long after the laughter faded, the warmth remained. Long after the steel cabin had proven itself again and again, people stopped thinking of it as unusual at all. It became part of the landscape, the way a river bend or an old fence line does. Newcomers learned about it the same way they learned where the wind cut hardest or which roads drifted shut first. It was simply knowledge passed along, quiet and practical. Children who grew up hearing the story didn't remember the laughter. They only remembered that one winter, when everything else failed, there had been a place that stayed warm. To them, the idea that anyone had mocked it seemed strange. Why would you laugh at something that worked, on especially cold nights, when the sky was clear and the stars sharp with frost? The steel shell still creaked softly as temperatures dropped. Inside, the air stayed steady. The fire burned low and slow. That quiet balance was the real achievement, not the metal or the wood, but the understanding behind them. And so the lesson lived on, not as a rule written down, but as a simple truth people carried with them. Winter cannot be challenged, only understood.